I'm so impressed also with this lovely lineup of all the people that I am allowed to introduce here today. The first one of which is Mr. Gerard de Zeeuw. He's emeritus professor in mathematical modeling of complex social systems at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, if you didn't know that. And he's known for his work on the theory and practice of action research. Google Gerard de Zeeuw, be impressed as much as I was, and I'm so honored to give you the microphone.
If somebody is using crutches, the immediate reaction obviously, he is getting old. But I've been using crutches for 50 years now, so in that sense I'm not old and I'm able to enjoy what we are doing today. Caroline has been mentioning a number of times that she met me when she was 19. It's only 5 years ago, of course. But I don't remember that, so I can't help. But I do remember one occasion when, many years ago, she organized what were called the HIV ball, the HIV party. And what happened at the time was that a number of people organized that, well, let me first say, the HIV people at the time were in a very bad position. They were excluded. There were people who didn't want to shake your hand because you had HIV, etc. So Caroline decided to make some form of engagement where people in the Netherlands and people in the United States could actually talk to each other and engage with each other. And for that she needed a number of things, like computers, people who could manage the computers. And at some point she got a person engaged who apparently had access to computers as well, had the knowledge to deal with the computers. So she engaged them, and then she needed somebody else who was able to do design, and then somebody else. And so after some time, she explained to me that it was a sudden revelation when after the ball, she found out that all the people she had engaged were from my department. But nobody had mentioned that. But the whole point was, at the time and still, we were engaged in projects where you needed a lot of different backgrounds to be able to engage in doing things that at the time were very difficult to do. And the HIV ball, in a sense, was a very important example. It is mentioned in her oration, that her inaugural address, but I'm not quite sure that I can quote because it's in Dutch. So, but one of the difficulties at the time, obviously, was to be able not to think about people in terms of abstract concept. He or she is ill. That's an abstract concept. But to think about people in the following way. Let me first say what is abstract. What is abstract in my view? There is a paper by Searle about the way that we understand languages. And his example is somebody who's trying to discuss a piece in Chinese and give answers in Chinese without knowing Chinese. So you have a set of Chinese symbols, you have a set of rules, and you have a set of answers in Chinese symbols. So as long as you follow the rules, you can answer in Chinese. The difficulty, of course, is, do you understand Chinese? And that is precise the type of insight, I think, that is very important in the work of Caroline. Once you engage people with a set of rules, you reduce the possibility of having their body, their experience, their cognition, everything engaged. So you have to create situations where actually the whole person is still there and is able to contribute to every single experience that is possible. So it is not the rules that actually make the possibility to respond in Chinese. It is the possibility to fill the rules with your personal experience. And that type of experience was new at the time. We have developed meanwhile many different, let us say, scientific ways of promoting that kind of development. So in that sense, there will be a lot of work in the future where I am sure that Caroline and I will engage again, even though it is only when she was 19 that it started. But I think that one of the main lessons that I drew from her inaugural address is that is still the way to go, to find out not what it is that you can do to somebody such that the person doesn't become a full human being, but to do something to that person such that the person becomes a full human being. That's my contribution.
Jill, she's from the Centre of Music and Science from Cambridge University in the UK, and she works on the embodiment of rhythm if there is one. Satinder.
When I first met Caroline, it's a few years ago now, I think that we touched on questions around culture, complexity of identity, communication, and most profoundly the notion of witness presence and its relationship to rhythm. And I had been looking at tacit knowledge and looking at the non-verbal communication of body and voice, how it is that we can share so much without understanding the content of the words, simply by the nuance of a movement and the subtlety of an intonation of voice. But Caroline's concept of witnessing adds a richer dimension within this discussion around the tacit, about how we connect, because it adds to that responsibility and action. And her framework, Yutpa framework, of how it is that we are together in time and place, adds to, and her work on Martin Buber explains why sometimes even if we see something, we don't necessarily intervene. So how close we feel connected and how tuned we feel to others affects whether we will intervene in a situation or not. So it affects the responsibility. I think that her talk yesterday brought it all together so powerfully and beautifully. And for me, her work has suggested that it's difficult just simply to talk about the tacit with also thinking about this concept of the witness. We talk discussions around the tacit, can talk about the aesthetic and the ethical dimension of communication. You know, if you have a good conversation with somebody, you move well with someone, it has to be both ethical and aesthetic. It feels good and it's mutually respectful. But the steps to take next about what we're going to do with the futures that we're confronted with regarding the online and the offline world. It's just that the witnessing and the action, responsibility, needs to become a fundamental part of the discussion around the aesthetic and the ethical. So I'm going to finish that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Satinder. Scott Cunningham. He's from Delft University of Technology, interested in working on decision sciences for policy making and models of social exchange and assessing new technology developments. So, a perfect person in the right place.
First, I'd like to thank Caroline for her inspiring inaugural. It was enlightening to have read it in English first and then to have heard it spoken in Dutch. I'm quite sure that anchored some new concepts for me. One of the assertions made in the inaugural was this: rhythm has been studied over the centuries in philosophy, anthropology, and the arts. And this certainly is been a delight for me personally in working with Caroline, is the broadening of my background in engineering and policy. Together with a colleague, Jan-Dirk Bolens, we're writing a chapter about green cities. And I learned an idea today. It may be familiar to some of you, but I'd like to share it with you. That's the field of time geography. I had never really thought about time geography until just about a week ago. But on first account, time and geography, it almost sounded absurd. Time is about place and location. How could there be a geography of time? So I want to give you a few quick examples and hopefully enable you to be a reflective practitioner about the geography of our time. So we could start here in our location here today in Zuidoost. And you could ask the concept of isochrone. I wish I had some maps for you, but it's a very short presentation. But an isochrone shows you how far you can get in a certain amount of time. So if you were to plot today, where could you get in an hour from Zuidoost? You'd see a broad swath of places in the Netherlands that you could reach within the first hour. The next thing that you could ask would be, well, is it reflexive? Is our time geography reflexive? Just because we can get here to there, can they return? Can they come back to us in that same amount of time? So I think this is very optimistic. But on a good day, you could reach Eindhoven in an hour, or so claims OpenStreetMaps. Now the question is, could you do that back? Is there any hope of getting from Eindhoven to Zuidoost in an hour? Absolutely not. It's not reflexive. The places that you are matter. So that's funny. There's places that are pockets where you can get trapped, where it's difficult to travel, where you don't have as much opportunity of mobility. Where I came from this morning is the Westerkwartier of Delft. So that's the first modern extension of the city of Delft. Another thing we could ask, is it equitable? So if you were to examine where you could travel from Delft in an hour, you would find that there's strictly less opportunities to travel. Strictly fewer places that you could get to in an hour than you could get to in Amsterdam. I also find that very fascinating. Some places are just strictly more rich in terms of possibility of who you can speak to, things you can learn, places that you could meet, business opportunities that you could conduct. So I would like to, wrapping up, I'd like to reflect with you about how strange the geography of time actually is. Unlike the Dutch landscape, and there were some beautiful photos of cityscapes, but Dutch landscapes often flat, often even, but time geography is not like that. It's non-linear, there's strange local pockets, and so I'd ask you to consider the opportunities that time gives us. If you were to look at this, you would easily conclude, I think, that Amsterdam is somehow projected 12 minutes ahead of other places in the Netherlands. It's almost like we're time travelers here. We can see more, we can do more, we can learn more things than many other places. So I'd ask you to reflect on other places in the world which are not just 12 minutes behind, but perhaps a week or more behind, or a month or more behind. So a closing comment also drawn from Caroline's inaugural: the performance of daily tasks, the interaction between different stakeholders, and the moments of performance and synchronization define a specific culture. And a lot of that is defined by geography. So I hope you'll join for a roundtable discussion about tuning rhythms, one of the extended discussions we'll have today. Thank you very much.
We move on to Erika Overmeer. She uses the camera to reflect on architectural processes, urbanism or urban planning, territory and conflict. She's a writer, she's a publisher, and she's a visual artist.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been very exciting to be with your ladies, with Caroline. Thank you for inviting me. It's the first time that I've been, as an artist and from my way of working with the urban context, that I've been invited in what I perceive as a more kind of academic context. And one of the things of an academic context is that people talk a lot, which is, for me, has been extremely inspiring. My head is spinning. I don't know where to focus right now, but this is also something that comes back, relates to my practice as such. That for me, photography is a way to focus on what makes my head spinning. The complexity of observation of urban complexity, of urban constellations. Through observation, reflect on those observations and translate those observations into an image. It's a different way of working with images in the sense that we are very much used on the use of photography more as visuals, as illustrations of a mental idea. This is also what I see very strongly in the publications that are being used in academic context. But there is a knowledge in photography, there's a knowledge in observation that can be transformed and communicated through photography. It's a photography that is not spontaneous, it doesn't react on, oh, this is a nice situation, oh, this is light. It takes me sometimes weeks and months to create an image based on my observations. I have tried to connect what I'm doing with the work that Caroline has been doing. I know Caroline for a long time. Usually I don't understand what she's talking about. But I always get there is something in it. And it was really, after all those years that I know Caroline, because of this talk last Friday, Inaugural address, I learned that from you, beautiful word, that I, for the first time, really understood not just the complexity, but also, since I'm a visual thinker and I can relate rather through visual images than through words, it was so evocative, it was so conclusive, and I finally got the span of your whole work. The rhythm is an important part of it. I tried to translate the idea of rhythm to the built environment the way I see it. The most direct relation is proportion. I researched proportion, and it turns out that the most basic, learning on proportion is based on music, is rhythm. Proportion was extracted from the wavelength of music, of sound. Just to put it very, very simple. I was not really prepared to start like this early. I thought I would have to say something after we did our workshop. So I tried to just to formulate very shortly a few points that I would like to discuss within the group. It's the complexity of observation. It's observation as related to an urban context, and how you translate this information, this visual information, into an image, and how we reflect on images and the images that we use in the context of our, of contemporary media. That's it, in short.
Paula Crespi. Her perspective is one from a philosopher's kind, and the current debate on the relevance of philosophy on performance and performance studies. A key tag for her is the dancer, choreographer Rudolf Laban. But today I thought she was not going to talk about it, but I was wrong. She is.
So yes, I'm going to tax you with Laban, as I have been hassling everyone over the past 5-6 years of my research. First of all, I wanted to say a big thank you to Carolina for inviting me here. I met Carolina 2 years ago at Goldsmiths. I organized a conference on rhythm. And she came all the way from Amsterdam and made contact with the people that were invited in the conference, and straight away then made contact again. And I just feel she's very much creating a group of people around her all the time. Beautiful people and beautiful conversation that I had over the past few days. So thank you for that. And thank you also for focusing your research on on something very similar to what I've decided to focus on, which is rhythm. So I kind of got into rhythm through the work of Rudolf Laban, which is a choreographer, which I focused my thesis on. And very early on, I realized that he thought of rhythm as this foundational aspect of our reality. And so, although he was a choreographer and a dancer, he was very much a philosopher. And so, through him and through translating some of his early text, so just to give you an idea, we're speaking about the beginning of the 20th century, I figured out that rhythm was very much a foundational principles of debates in culture, in politics, and all over really in the sciences back then. And that somehow we forgot about it. And it's emerging again nowadays. So there's been this syncopation of interest, let's say, in rhythm. And some of the things that they were discussing back then are probably potentially have something to contribute to Carolina's research, and to whomever wants to take rhythm as something that inspires their work. I hope, from what I understood, you're all designers and architects and coming from the art world, so probably speaking about rhythm and time in your practices could be very much interesting. In relation to the geography talk that just took place by Scott before, I would say rhythm is just a way of complicating these approaches to time. Because time is a very abstract concept most of the time, and rhythm is the form of time or the variation in the patterns of time. And if you go into philosophy of it, there are so many definitions of rhythm that you really much have to choose one. I'm currently editing a collection on rhythm, of which Carolina and Pinar's project on pseudo rhythm is part. But there are many other approaches to rhythm, and there is a variety of them. What struck me and what's really interesting for me coming from theory is that Carolina and Pinar's and your project of pseudo rhythm really gives an answer to what is a rhythm analysis. Because from Lefebvre we really much know that we can use rhythm to analyze social happenings and context. But even Lefebvre himself doesn't offer very much of an answer to how do we go about it. And I think that's very much the start of the project of pseudo rhythms, and most possibly also what's coming next. And it's a very valuable contribution also to the theoretical framework of how we go about it. And it's not going to be easy, I suppose, also because one should define probably what rhythm is, and defining rhythm as variation of a pattern, it's a very interesting, I find, way to start. So going back to Carolina's address on Thursday, I find that I'm familiar more with the rhythm aspects of her research, but very much less familiar with the witnessing aspect and reflection as opposed to reflexive way of carrying research. And I find that very fascinating, especially in relation to artificial intelligence, and how might artificial intelligence be able to witness and mirror us. And Carolina states that she came to the conclusion that there needs to be physical proximity, so our bodies, and there needs to be an embodiment to it. And she proposes a lot of very stimulating questions in her address, and one of them is, how do we take into account that maybe in the future robots and artificial intelligence will be able to witness us and will be able to maybe mirror us, even though they're not embodied, even though they don't they're not human, let's say. And putting rhythm into this debate makes things more interesting, I suppose. Also because rhythm can be thought of as a mediator in itself, a mediator and an expresser of affect and witnessing and all this very qualitative, let's say, aspects of human communication that are very difficult to pin down. And so I guess a lot of questions and a lot of complexity, and we will be discussing this in the tuning rhythm workshop later on. Thank you very much.
Okay, up to Danielle Clich. Since the 90s, Danielle does international comparative studies in the field of culture and politics. She joined UNESCO, working on a program that strengthens cultural governance and fostering a dynamic cultural sector. Danielle.
Good morning, everyone. I have the old-fashioned paper version of the speeches. I was very impressed this morning with everybody's mobile phone reading the speech, but also to hear everybody's impression of how they interpreted Caroline's lecture 2 days ago. So I'm Danielle. We studied together with Caroline many years ago now. She reminded me the other day it was 11 years. I thought it was only a few years ago, but it's now 11 years. She was and is a person that I admire very much, and her lecture on Thursday sort of brought together all of those reasons why I admire her as a scholar and as a person. So my take on her lecture is that it's about the sum parts of herself. So she argues in the beginning of her lecture about building bridges between scientific research, policy, artistic expression, and how this can be co-mediated or constructed through design. And one of the things that I loved what she said is that policymaking is also a design discipline, not just a technocratic process. And that's something that I learned with her many years ago when we were doing our dissertation, and what I try to use in my practice every day today at the global level. Caroline always puts people first. She puts people first in her life, and she puts people first in her research. In her text, she develops the idea of collaborative authoring. She says that people are at the heart of development, which is something also that I work on in my daily life. But she also says that people at the heart of development require this communication between designers and policymakers in terms of dynamics and meta design. And that's not something I hear every day from policymakers. And so this putting people together to co-create is something that for me was also one of those powerful messages from her lecture, that she then further develops to say that diversity, that the more diversity we have, the more the diverse people we have, the better the outcome. And that's also something that at the global level we're trying to communicate every day. She says in her lecture that by establishing a rhythm, and I'm by no means a rhythm specialist, this is something that I've been learning about the last days, but what I learned is that her emphasis on studying or contributing to a rhythm within this diversity that we have gives us a certain ability to communicate that will fundamentally enhance a sense of trust between people. This can be at the neighborhood level, which she focuses on, at the city level, but I would also argue, after hearing her lecture and knowing her and the ideas that are coming out over the last days interacting with you, that this is a model that can be used also at the global level. Caroline not only inspires experiences, but she also designs them. In her lecture, she talks about the urban design experience, but she is the experience. She gives us this experience, and it goes really to the heart of complex governance structures. Knowing Caroline, she always pokes her finger right in the heart of these complex governance structures. She moves it around and tries to bring light in through the subcultures that she's also been a part of and has inspired to come into the light. We know this in her lecture from her squatter days to the pioneering work that she did in the 80s and 90s at the Paradiso, which I studied from afar even before I knew her. I admired her even before we met many years later. And I'm very sure that the work that's going to happen now through the Designing Urban Experience Research Group will have that same enlightening effect. Will have that same poking of the finger and turning the pot around that we can then use as an outcome for our work on new models of participatory governance, which is also something that I'm working on right now. There are other ideas. Her text is so rich it's hard to just find one thread through. But one thing that also inspired me in her lecture is the following. She says, crisis leads to empowerment, which can lead to resistance, which subsequently led to policy renewal and social innovation. She concludes that it is possible to develop policies for essential conditions to which people's empowerment and capacity for innovation is core. And this again is something that I very much can relate to and understand. It's so eloquent the way you said it, and we will use it, I'm sure, many times. But when we talk about international law, this is how I try to see it, is that it comes out of a crisis and it's used as a tool to develop eventually some type of policy and social renewal and innovation, eventually depending on how we use it. If we use it in a dynamic way rather than a technocratic way, as a design process. And that's what I love so much about her lecture. Caroline, she is also the embodiment of her Yukta framework. She brings together unity of time, place, and action. She is creating a rhythm in the design of urban experiences, and that can lead to the policy renewal and social innovation. We can already see how the work of Caroline and her colleagues will be able to break new ground over the next 5 years, how they will be able to develop new methodologies that will be transferable to cities around the world. But how do we know this? We know this because Caroline puts people first. Rhythm-based human communication is used in local systems in governance around the world, whatever the community, the language, or the urban experience. So I'm hoping that these 5 years go quickly because we are very looking forward to all of the research and the models that you will develop. Congratulations.
We move on to Orion Harvey. She's a visual artist, started out to work on interactivity, net art, art video games, and she's the first professor of games at the Kunsthochschule in Kassel.
Hello everyone. First I'd like to, for once again, inviting me into a situation where I'm like, what? Why am I here? No, but it's, I am another one of these people who's not exactly an academic, and so I'm sitting here like, and I also missed the speech on Thursday, which really is unfortunate, but I've been reading it, and there's so much to reflect upon in this, and it just reminds me so much of what I found remarkable about Caroline and the things that she does from the very moment that I met her. It's like she's always trying to draw together all these different concepts from design to make a difference and make a better place for world for people to exist in. And what I pulled from this, mostly I was trying to relate it to things that I did know about, since I don't know much about urban planning and all of the larger issues. But I also was seriously sitting there like, why did she invite me to say something about rhythm? My work is mainly as a game designer, or has been as a game designer for video games, and developer, programming, but primarily I work as a 3D artist, making the things that one sees and interacts with, the worlds, the virtual world that is around you in a video game. And so things that I pulled from her speech that I found so fascinating, first of all, the speaking about 4D, 5D, 6D. I mean, of course, I've always thought of 4D, you know, knowing that this is time. But these are immutable concepts. The idea of 3 dimensions in the world around you is something, yes, okay, this makes sense. Time, all right, I accept this. But then 5D and 6D having to do with strategic design in this particular example, and 6D having to do with governance structures. I was just like, wow. So the reason why I found this interesting and something that perhaps we could discuss as a tool that we could use in the group is what else could 5D and 6D be? I mean, in this case, it has to do with this idea of rhythm and structure and governance and all of this. But how else can the idea of adding dimensions to the world be used to enhance the urban experience? I find this really fascinating. The other thing that I really pulled away from this was this difference between experience and ervaring. Belevenis, yeah, belevenis, yeah. This is amazing also because in my practice, it's all about people using their imaginations to project themselves into an avatar, into a virtual world. And people come away from it feeling as if they have lived it. And this is something different than actually experiencing something with your body. And yet this is something that people felt happened to them or felt they lived through. And how I also find that an interesting thing reflected in this talk. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly for me, was the question, actually, is it possible at all to communicate physically embodied knowledge by means of mediated communication? And how are traditional values like solidarity or shared beliefs affected by these new possibilities? This is something that I deal with a lot when creating virtual environments, actually. And the one thing I felt, okay, finally I understand why I'm here, was I'll just describe briefly a video game that I've made, and it's called The Endless Forest. And in this game, everyone plays a deer. It's a multi-user environment, a multiplayer environment, in which everyone plays a deer. In this game, you are an animal. Thus, you cannot speak. And you cannot chat, and you cannot, you know, to me this design was very much on purpose because we didn't want people to be able, in essence, to be mean to one another. We wanted to create a world where only perfect harmony was possible. And how could we make that possible? And the first thing we thought, well, we take away the means of communication. We take away the human way of communicating. In this game, the way you communicate with one another is through your body language, through making various noises. We provide tools, basically, to allow people to communicate in what we feel is a more tactile way. The way you communicate with the world is through running and through rubbing on trees and things and finding things in the natural environment. And then the way you communicate with one another is through sounds you make, through gestures that you make. And anyway, this has led to a situation where the people who play the game always have this feeling of that they know what each other are saying to one another without actually saying anything. And we hoped, and we still hope through this game, that people take a bit of that into the real world, realizing that you don't have to actually understand each other to understand each other. And this has been a very beautiful thing, observing players in the game and how they develop a means of nonverbal or speaking, non-language communication has been something that we've folded back then into that virtual world. So I think for me, during this seminar, this workshop, the interesting thing for me to discuss with the participants would be what can we learn from virtual urban experiences? How has, we all are involved in virtual worlds, be it Facebook or actually playing a game. How can we learn what not to do? You know, how can we develop new dimensions and learn from those experiences that we've had in these virtual environments and bring that into our real world? Because to me, this has been, my virtual experiences have been in some ways on par with my, or as just as important as my physical world experiences. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say. Thank you.
Next speaker is Angelo Thermal. He's biologist, space systems researcher, and an artist. He's a crew commander of the NASA Mars simulation, and his rhythms are not limited to urban context, but he reaches out to outer space.
Good morning, everyone. I've basically I've been listening to Caroline. I was very impressed with the talk. Actually, I think we met about 8 or 9 years ago. And the first conversation, deep conversation I had with Caroline was at FOAM in Brussels, cultural organization there. And I had no idea what she was talking about. I was like, what kind of language is this? Because for me, sociology was brand new. I must say, working with Caroline over the past 2 years really transformed my way of looking at things. My expertise is mostly in technological and ecological systems, but through Caroline, I've been able to connect it with the human dimension, so that's something I'm very grateful about. What I briefly want to address today are 3 topics that I distilled from the speech from Caroline, and the first one is collaborative authoring, diversity, and then rhythm. When I think about collaborative authoring, I still remember when Caroline came up with this concept. It's very interesting. It's kind of an interesting umbrella concept. Personally, what I've been working with, the concepts that I've been working with are co-creation and bottom-up design. And there is a lot of confusion about what these terms actually mean. And a lot of people think when they hear co-creation that it's like something like being creative together, creating something together, but that's not really co-creation. What I find fascinating about the real definition of co-creation is it's about people stepping out of their original self-defined role, which mostly comes through education and professional life, and you step into another field as an amateur, but you truly get the freedom to contribute to that other field. And what I find specifically interesting is when you have a group of people and all the different people in the group start doing this. They start stepping into each other's domains, and then you get a very interesting dynamic. I think that's really the beauty of true co-creation. It requires trust, because of course suddenly this whole idea of expert is becoming is getting questioned. So that's really another interesting link to Caroline's thinking. And then there's also bottom-up design. That's my personal fascination for emergence. I'm a biologist. I think many biologists, consciously or subconsciously, are fascinated by emergence. Instead of having overarching models, blueprints that basically dictate what people need to do, you can establish a few rules and then let systems emerge out of the interactions that come about through those rules. Termites are a famous biological example. There is never a central termite architect that determines how a termite mound needs to be built. These beautiful engineered structures come about through emergence. And I think also socially, this is really a very fascinating phenomenon. And of course, it involves a different perspective on leadership. And so those 2 concepts for me fit under that umbrella that Caroline talks about, collaborative authoring. And what I like about the concept of collaborative authoring is that it implies an ethics on authorship, which is often left out. And this is something that kind of irritates me quite a bit in the art scene, for example, where artists are working sometimes with armies of talented people, but in the end, it's the name of the artist. And because the name of the artist is important because of the art market. And you get this whole perverse system. And I think with collaborative authoring, there is a whole different possibility that opens up to basically honor the talents and the inputs of different people working together. So I think that's really an interesting perspective there. The second topic that I'm going to briefly touch upon is diversity. I was very happy to hear in the text that diversity was one of the things that was brought up. And I have a personal kind of theory that I also co-developed with Caroline. We just published a chapter in a publication that was published by Z33, Studio Time it's called. And we basically made a publication on the role of diversity and the importance of diversity in creating multiple futures and making sure that those multiple futures, we call it diversified futures, are coexisting and are being kept alive simultaneously. So you move away from the Darwinian perspective where one solution is the best solution, but you maintain a diversity of futures. And the concept we developed is called nested diversity. It's basically a layered approach to diversity. And it starts with individual diversity. Once again, going back to something I said earlier, we define ourselves mostly coming from our educational background and professional background. But of course, there's multiple capacities that are embedded in each person. Most of these capacities coming through life as it happens. There's very much more than professional things and educational things. And so once you start tapping into the inner diversity of each person, you open up huge possibilities. And the second level is if you build a team, because I'm basically a community artist, so I love to bring people together, and you actively seek out diversity. I always say you need to craft diversity. And diversity is not something that comes about naturally. You really need to craft, nurture, and maintain it. People have a tendency to flock with the things that they know. So you have the inner diversity, then you can build diversity between people, and then the last level is intercultural diversity. It's another big topic, issue, often a source of conflict, of misunderstanding. And what we do in our projects, in the projects that I've set up with communities, is basically using that layered structure of diversity and trying to maximize it. And my belief is that through doing that, you maximize collective intelligence, and that's really what it's all about, I think. This doesn't happen naturally. This needs facilitation, for sure. But I think the concept of diversity connected to collective intelligence is another notion that I think is worth exploring. And then last, rhythm. One of the interesting things that I discussed with Caroline was when we were talking about rhythm, is related to one of the projects that I'm doing with I co-founded an art science collective, which is called SEED. And our most well-known project is called Biomod. And it's a project in which we recycle e-waste. We build computer networks out of the e-waste that are still functioning. And then we build living ecosystems inside the computers that use the waste heat of the electronics to grow and develop. And in subsequent versions, we added sensors and electronics to make the interactions between biology and technology more deep. Now, one of the things that Caroline immediately brought up was, and it's actually something that stayed with me, is the enormous diversity of rhythms within such a work. And it's very difficult to make them communicate. And I'll explain this a little better. For example, we were using water cooling in our systems, or we are using water cooling, but instead of using commercial coolant liquid, we use cultures of single-celled algae. So we're pumping microscopic algae physically through computers to cool them, so the motherboard is actually doing what it's supposed to do. So you get a very strange symbiosis between a motherboard and a single-celled algae. But you can already feel that the rhythms of those two worlds are dramatically different, and it's almost an impossible battle to make them sync. But I think that's one part of the beauty of the artwork. It's really, this tension is in there. Moreover, the work is created within a co-creation context. And when the work is finished, people can actually join the network. They can log into the network and start gaming with each other. So that brings me a little bit closer to Oria's work. So we install multiplayer computer games on this network. So you have the social interaction, the technological dynamics, and the biological dynamics all interacting, but with very different rhythms. And I think that's something that definitely stayed with me. It doesn't always have to be synchronized. Not being synchronized can also raise interesting questions. And then last but not least, related to rhythm is my high seas experience. It was already announced. I've been part of a Mars simulation mission for NASA. I lived in a Mars base that was built on the flank of the Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii, simulating life on Mars with a crew of 6 people isolated for 120 days. I was a commander of the mission, and rhythm was really key. So what happened, I did, together with Caroline, we did an analysis, a UTPA analysis basically. And out of the preliminary data, you can see that in our conversations in the beginning of the mission, a lot of attention goes to synchronizing rhythm. It's really a group of people that don't really know each other very well, trying to synchronize the rhythm in a very confined situation. And then gradually over time, we found our rhythms, and basically we don't talk as much about it anymore. You can really see it in the data. But also what I found, and this is to conclude, what I found really interesting is the relationship between this kind of rhythm and trust. And it's really a dialectic relationship. So the more the group is syncing, the more the level of trust seems to be rising. It's a bit of a subjective interpretation. I don't have hard data for this. But on the other hand, if trust levels are increasing, people want to synchronize. They feel a desire to synchronize. And that's a really interesting, so it's not one or the other, it's really both simultaneously. On the other hand, things can spiral out of control very quickly in this dynamics. It's really a runaway effect. Once trust or the rhythm are disrupted, the whole thing spirals down. And so I think there is an opportunity there for design research also to constructively design situations where you maximize trust and rhythm in order to build better communities. Thank you.
So we started out with Irina Shapiro, and she kicked off the seminar. So we come back to her as the last person to reflect on Caroline's inaugural address. And as we heard, her recent practice is about developing design projects, educational projects outside and inside of the educational and institutional environments.
It's really an honor to respond to the Caroline's address, and it's a little bit challenging to close up this lineup, I have to say, after everything what was said. And I feel like I can respond to the talk 2 days ago as a designer and educator. Because as a designer, I work with education as a medium. So that's how I work with design students. So this is kind of, I'm in a loop of this design discourse. And something what really, I kept putting attention on this chapter and many things what was said in that, in a new role of design, because this is something what in the academia and in the independent environment, this is something what is always addressed, because the school delivers new professionals, right, and the new role or old role is super important. And it's really remarkable that Caroline gives so much agency and so much importance to artistic or design research that it easily can be neglected. But I would like to kind of come back to the real life situation in a way, because of course there are pioneering schools, pioneering curriculums, but real life situation is when design students are educated are given some particular set of specific tools to address specific brief or a problem. An interesting moment here is that the problem is assumed to be correct. They are not really trained, if I may use this word, or encouraged or motivated to address it, to problematize the problem. So they are quite often, sorry, I have to be general in this short time, educated to be neutral. And even if we are talking about, for instance, participatory designs, sometimes they can be involved as facilitators, and then the experts, so they facilitate a framework, and then the experts come and bring their input, and then this input is interpreted by the client, by the expert, etc. This is something, for instance, in this academy, there is this seminar for half a year when students have to work together very closely with a local community center. And then after half a year, what I see is this, like 90% of the posters, then few apps for the lucky ones who can do it, and then some websites. And I'm always thinking, hey, are there any designers who are interested in policy making? Are there any designers who want really to engage as designers, as artists, into the conversation with stakeholders? And maybe they are, but for me, I feel like in order to facilitate, in order to support them to do that, perhaps the school should have maybe different tools. We should offer them something else, a different possibility to access the problem, access the brief, not sharpen it, but really problematize it. Also, young designers don't feel invited to contribute to that. Because again, on the other side of the spectrum, there is a client, whether you call it as a city or a scientific consortium, that treat designers as executors or people who visualize the process or the knowledge that was developed. But it really takes a lot of effort to communicate that the knowledge that designers and artists are bringing is equally important in the process of formulation of the problem and of interpreting what artistic or design intervention meant or can mean for the policy making. And another thing, what is really now is quite often used as sort of a mantra, saying designers are problem solvers. I know that Caroline means it differently. Caroline means this human agency in that, not just automatically. However, coming back to the real context, what I see in the young designers in the problems they have to encounter, it's that they are pressed to bring these solutions. And the tricky thing is that sometimes, so there is, for instance, this design thinking method, and a lot of emphasis is put on formulating the problem, and then there is a phase of testing and implementation. But the interesting thing is that the problem is actually defined during implementation. So, by definition in this case, the designer fails because he or she doesn't solve anything, but rather redefine the problem or said, okay, this is not a problem at all, right? So it resonates what Angelo was saying about collaborative agency, I would say, collaborative authorship, where the authorship allows to fail in the way how the project was approached. And because, again, of this pressure or budget pressure, time pressure, whatever pressure, then the designers sometimes intuitively even go into framing, not really encouraging this failure, but framing what has been developed into the result, into the product that can be implemented. And I think these pressures from all sides, this is something interesting to address and think how that could be addressed. That's I would say would be my focus point to bring further for the table discussion. Thank you so much.